We can't approve this without additional documentation, Diane. That was 2:47 in the afternoon when she said it. I remember the exact time because I had glanced at the clock the moment the words landed. There's something about hearing a bureaucratic answer to a life-changing question that makes you notice the small details, like the way the fluorescent light hummed above her desk, or how her nameplate was slightly crooked, or how the manila folder in front of me, the one containing the pathology report I had received 90 minutes earlier, suddenly felt heavier than it had any right to feel. We were in HR's corner office. Beige walls, ergonomic chairs, one of those motivational posters about teamwork that always seem to hang in rooms where teamwork doesn't actually happen. Across from me sat Rachel Whitmore, head of human resources, mid-40s, practiced smile. The kind of person who had a specific tone for every kind of conversation, and right now she was using the tone reserved for policy, not people. To her left, standing near the doorway with his arms crossed, was Grant Peterson, the firm's managing partner. Silver-haired, six-figure suit, the sort of man who liked to be present for difficult conversations but never actually participated in them. He didn't look at me either. That part I'll remember longest. The policy requires a signed physician certificate on official letterhead, listing specific limitations and expected duration, Rachel continued, sliding my paperwork back across the desk. This is just an appointment summary. An appointment summary. That is what she called it. The pathology report from Dr. Marston. The words invasive ductal carcinoma printed clearly in the middle paragraph. The recommendation to begin treatment within 2 weeks. To her, it was insufficient documentation. I received the diagnosis this morning, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The full treatment plan is being drafted. My oncologist said I could bring updated forms by end of week. That would be the appropriate next step, she said, as if she were walking me through a subscription cancellation. In the meantime, I can't process this request. You will need to continue using PTO until we have the proper paperwork. PTO. 12 days. That was what I had left after covering my mother's funeral in April and my daughter's surgery in June. 12 days to face a diagnosis I had not even had time to say out loud yet. I sat there for a moment, not arguing, not pushing back, just letting the situation settle over me. Because at some point, you stop trying to convince people who have already made a decision. My name is Diane Whitfield. I am 51 years old, and at that moment I had spent 17 years at Peterson, Hollies, and Vance, senior compliance officer, the person who kept the firm's licenses current, its filings on time, its regulatory bodies satisfied, the person the partners quietly relied on but rarely thanked. Rachel closed my folder with the kind of finality you use on completed tasks. We appreciate your service, Diane. I'm sure your medical team will provide what we need soon. Service. That was the word she chose. Not contribution, not work. Service, like I was a vendor waiting to be reimbursed. Grant finally spoke from the doorway. We're pulling for you, Diane, really. He said it the way people say drive safe, automatic, weightless. He still did not meet my eyes. I nodded once, slow, controlled. Understood, I said. No argument, no emotion, because there is a point in a conversation like that where you realize it is not about paperwork at all. It is about how they see you, and more importantly, how they do not. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, and thanked them for their time, polite, professional, exactly the way they expected someone like me to respond. That is the role, too, not just managing compliance, managing perception. As I walked out of the office, I caught my reflection in the glass door. Same posture, same calm face. You would not know anything had just shifted, but it had. Because that was not just a denial of leave. It was a decision, not about paperwork, about value. I did not go back to my desk right away. I walked to the end of the hallway instead, past the glass conference rooms, past the framed photographs of past client dinners, past the wall where the firm proudly displayed all 6 of its active licenses: corporate law, securities practice, real estate, tax advisory, trust administration, regulatory compliance certification. 6 licenses. 6 revenue streams. 6 reasons this firm existed as more than a name on a lease. I stopped in front of them for a moment, not out of sentiment, out of habit. I had renewed every single one of those licenses for the last 17 years, some of them twice a year, some quarterly. Every filing, every fee, every continuing education credit for every partner and associate who needed one to keep practicing. It was my name at the bottom of every submission cover letter, my signature on every affidavit of accuracy, my knowledge of every deadline, every jurisdictional quirk, every reviewer at every state board who preferred email over portal uploads. None of the partners knew those details. They did not need to. That was my job. I walked back to my office and closed the door behind me, sat down at my desk, did not open my email, did not open the compliance calendar, just looked at the folder in my hand, the pathology report, the referral to the oncology center, the pamphlet on treatment options that Dr. Marston had pressed into my palm with a look I had never seen on a doctor's face before. Not pity, something closer to solidarity. I had walked into Rachel's office thinking I would tell her what was happening, ask for the leave I had every right to request, and walk out with a plan. Instead, I walked out with a lesson. And the lesson was simple. This firm did not see me as a person. It saw me as a function, and the function had a policy attached to it. I opened my laptop. The compliance dashboard loaded automatically, green across the board, every deadline tracked, every license current, every filing scheduled. To anyone looking at that screen, the firm was running like a machine, but I knew better, because I was the machine. There was a securities license renewal due in 11 days, a continuing legal education audit response due in 19, a state bar recertification for 2 of the partners in 26 days, a trust administration bond renewal in 31, and underneath all of that, quietly, the annual regulatory compliance certification for the firm itself, the one that let Peterson, Hollies, and Vance advertise itself as a full-service practice, due in 47 days. Every one of those items had my name on it. Every one of those items had layers of preparation that existed nowhere except in my head, and in the private notes I kept in a spreadsheet only I had access to. The official system showed deadlines. It did not show the 2-week lead time I built into every filing to account for board delays. It did not show which reviewer required physical mail versus digital. It did not show which partner needed 3 reminders before signing off on their portion. That was not documentation. That was memory, mine. I sat there for a long time, long enough that my assistant, Corinne, knocked twice before poking her head in. "You okay?" she asked. Corinne had been with me for 9 years. She read faces the way I read regulatory calendars. "Long meeting," I said. She looked at me for a second longer than usual, then nodded and closed the door. I turned back to the screen, and for the first time in 17 years, I did not open the next task in my queue. I opened a blank document instead. At the top, I typed a single line, not a to-do list, not a resignation letter, just a question. What happens to this firm if I stop being the person who remembers? Then I closed the laptop, picked up my folder, and went home. I did not tell my husband that night. That surprises people when I mention it later, but if you have been married 30 years, you understand there is a rhythm to hard news. You do not walk in the door and drop it on the kitchen counter next to the mail. You wait until the dishes are done, until the dog has been walked, until the evening has softened enough to hold something heavy. Ellis was in the living room when I got home, watching a documentary about the Panama Canal of all things. He looked up, smiled, asked how my day was. I said fine. He nodded and went back to the screen. That was the moment I understood something about myself. I had spent so long being the person who absorbed pressure without releasing it that I could not even release it at home. Not right away. I needed to sit with it first, understand it, turn it in my hands like a stone before I handed it to someone else. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop. The document from earlier was still there. That single line at the top. What happens to this firm if I stop being the person who remembers? I read it twice. Then I started answering it, not emotionally, methodically, the way I approached every compliance audit I had ever run. I made a list of every license the firm held. I made a second list of every deadline attached to each one. A third of every dependency, meaning every person who had to sign, every fee that had to clear, Every document that had to be assembled from 3 different partners who never responded to internal emails within a week. By the time the tea was cold, I had 4 pages, and that was just the surface layer, the obvious pieces. I had not even started on the informal things, the relationships with reviewers, the unwritten workarounds, the one state board that had flagged us twice for late submissions and only stopped after I personally called their director and worked out a courtesy notification arrangement. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I opened a new tab and searched for something I had not searched for in 17 years. Employment attorney, medical leave, retaliation. Not because I was planning to sue. I was not. I have never been the kind of person who leads with legal threats, but I wanted to understand my position. Because Rachel's denial that afternoon had felt technically correct in a way that made me suspicious. Nobody who is on solid legal ground uses the word documentation that many times in a single sentence. I read for 2 hours. I learned that the Family and Medical Leave Act does not actually require a signed physician's certificate on the day of the request. It requires it within 15 calendar days of the request being made. I learned that an employer cannot deny leave outright pending documentation. They must provisionally accept the request and then verify. I learned that requiring an employee to burn PTO instead of processing an FMLA request could constitute interference, which is a specific term with specific consequences. I did not feel triumphant reading any of it. I felt tired, because I realized Rachel had not made a mistake. She had made a calculation. She had bet that I would not know the difference. She had bet that I would go home, cry, come back the next morning, and hand over the PTO days without a word. She had bet on the version of me that had spent 17 years absorbing pressure without releasing it. I closed the laptop and went upstairs. Ellis was already in bed, reading. I sat on the edge of the mattress and told him then, all of it, the diagnosis, the meeting, the 4 pages I had just finished writing. He did not say much. He just took my hand and held it, and after a while he said, "Whatever you decide to do, I am here." That was all I needed to hear. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was crying, though there was some of that too, but because my mind kept doing the thing it always did when I faced a complex problem. It kept building lists, subroutines, contingencies. The compliance officer's brain does not turn off just because the subject matter has become personal. By 4 in the morning, I had a decision. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one. The kind of decision that changes everything without announcing itself. I would go into work the next morning. I would do my job exactly as I had always done it, and I would begin, calmly and methodically, to separate myself from the parts of the firm that only worked because I made them work. I was not going to sabotage anything. That was not my style, and it never would be. But I was also not going to keep protecting a system that had just told me my diagnosis was insufficient documentation. There is a difference between causing harm and simply stepping back, between damaging and revealing. What I had built over 17 years was going to keep running as long as I kept running it. The moment I stopped, the truth of what I had been doing would become visible on its own. That was not revenge. That was gravity. I arrived at the office at 7:45, same as always. Karen was already at her desk, coffee in hand. She looked up as I passed. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. "I am now," I said, and I meant it. I sat down at my desk and opened the compliance dashboard, green across the board, same as yesterday, same as every day for 17 years. I looked at the top item in my queue, the securities license renewal due in 11 days. Normally, I would have already started assembling the packet, calling the 2 partners whose signatures I needed, drafting the cover letter that I had personalized differently for every state examiner over the years. Instead, I opened the internal task management system, the one the firm had paid a consultant $30,000 to implement 4 years ago, and which no one actually used because it was clunky and I had always just handled things directly. I created a new task. Assigned it to the compliance queue, which technically included 2 junior paralegals who had never done a license renewal in their lives. Attached the standard checklist that the software auto-generated. Set the due date, and moved on. That was it. No hidden notes, no personal reminders, no 2-week lead time built into the deadline, just the task exactly as the official system said it should be. I did the same for the CLE audit response, the bar recertifications, the trust bond renewal. One by one, I transferred every item from my private tracking spreadsheet into the official task queue, clean, documented, visible. For the first time in 17 years, the compliance function at Peterson, Hollies, and Vance existed on paper the way the firm had always believed it existed. Around 10, I walked to Rachel's office and knocked on her open door. She looked up, mildly surprised. "Do you have a minute?" I asked. "Of course, come in." I sat down and placed a folder on her desk. Inside was a printed copy of the FMLA request form, filled out completely, along with a certified letter from Dr. Marston's office that I had picked up on my way to work. Full physician certification, official letterhead, specific limitations, expected duration of 6 to 9 months for treatment and recovery. Rachel opened the folder, scanned the letter. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "I also want to note for the record," I said, "that yesterday's denial of my leave request pending documentation was not compliant with FMLA regulations. Employers are required to provisionally approve leave and verify within 15 calendar days. I'm certain that was an oversight." She looked up at me, slowly, carefully. "I'll process this right away," she said. "Thank you," I said, and I left. I did not go back to my office right away. I walked the long way, past the licensing wall again, past the framed photographs, past the small kitchen where 2 associates were arguing about a coffee pod. I wanted a moment to feel what had just happened, not celebrate it, just register it, because something had shifted in that room and Rachel knew it. She had spent yesterday afternoon assuming she was dealing with the version of me that had existed for 17 years. The one who absorbed, the one who accommodated, the one who understood policy as something applied to her, not something she could apply back. And in one 3-minute conversation, that assumption had been quietly dismantled. She would not say anything about it. That was not how people like Rachel operated, but she would remember, and more importantly, she would tell Grant. I got back to my desk and continued the work I had started that morning. Not frantically, not in a rush. Just steadily. Every item in my personal spreadsheet, one by one, moved into the official system. Every note that had lived in my head transcribed. Every workaround documented in plain language that any competent paralegal could follow if they read it, if they knew to look for it, if they understood that the checklist was not the whole picture. That was the part that stayed with me as I worked. The checklist was never the whole picture. It never had been. I had known that from my first year at the firm, when I had watched a securities filing get rejected because the previous compliance officer had submitted it exactly according to the state's published requirements. The problem was that the state's published requirements were 3 years out of date, and the actual reviewer wanted a supplementary attachment that existed nowhere in official documentation. You only knew that if you had called the reviewer, which the previous compliance officer had not, which was why the previous compliance officer had been replaced by me. 17 years of that kind of knowledge, now written down in a task management system that treated every item as a checkbox. Around 2 in the afternoon, Karen came into my office and closed the door behind her. "Rachel just walked past my desk twice," she said. She looked like she was going to say something and then didn't. I nodded. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Karen asked. I looked at her for a long moment. Karen was not a partner, she was not HR. She was the person who had covered for me during my mother's funeral, who had rescheduled 3 meetings during my daughter's surgery, who had known before I did that I was going to Dr. Marston's office yesterday because she had made the appointment for me. She had earned honesty, so I told her, not everything, but enough. The diagnosis, the meeting, the denial, the FMLA letter I had delivered that morning. Karen sat down in the chair across from my desk and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "How long have you known? About the cancer, since yesterday morning, about the firm, longer." She nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now," I said. "Just do your job, keep doing it well. And if anyone comes to you looking for something that used to come to me directly, send them to the task queue. The task queue, she repeated. The one nobody uses. The one nobody uses yet. She looked at me for a long moment. Then a small, careful smile crossed her face. Not amusement, something closer to recognition. The kind of smile that passes between two people who have both been underestimated for a long time and have just realized they are about to stop being underestimated. Understood, she said. She stood up, opened the door, and went back to her desk. And I turned back to my screen and kept working. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my career. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. I came in every morning at 7:45. I left every evening at 5:30. I attended the weekly operations meeting on Tuesdays and the partner briefing on Thursdays. I answered every email within a business day. I processed the securities license renewal on schedule, filed it 2 days before the deadline, and received confirmation from the state examiner within 48 hours. From every metric the firm tracked, I was performing exactly the way I always had. But underneath, the change was constant. Every task I completed, I documented in the official system. Every phone call I made to a reviewer or examiner, I logged with names and extensions. Every workaround I used, I wrote out in step-by-step language that assumed no prior knowledge. Not because I was building a case, because I was building a record. There is a difference. A case is something you use against someone. A record is something that exists whether anyone reads it or not. I also began scheduling my treatment. Dr. Marston's office coordinated with the oncology center, and by the end of the second week I had a full plan. Surgery in 22 days, chemotherapy beginning 3 weeks after that, 6 cycles spaced 3 weeks apart, radiation to follow 5 days a week for 6 weeks. The letter I had given Rachel said 6 to 9 months. The actual timeline, if everything went well, was closer to 8. If everything went well. That was the phrase Dr. Marston used, and I appreciated her honesty. She was not the kind of doctor who told you what you wanted to hear. She told you what was true and let you decide what to do with it. In that way, she reminded me of myself, or at least the version of myself I was becoming. Ellis came with me to the pre-surgical consultation. He held my hand in the waiting room the way he had that first night in our bedroom, quiet, steady, present. He asked the questions I forgot to ask. He wrote down the answers I forgot to write. On the drive home, he said only one thing: "You don't have to go back after this to the firm if you don't want to." I looked over at him. "I know, I mean it. I know you mean it. I'm not ready to decide yet." He nodded, and we drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence. At the firm, the small signs began. Nothing anyone else would have noticed, but I noticed. Rachel avoided the compliance hallway. Grant stopped by my office twice in 1 week, both times to ask questions he had never asked before. How was the securities filing going? Was there anything I needed? Was I feeling supported? The word supported. He used it twice in one conversation. That was not a word Grant Peterson used naturally. Someone had told him to use it. The firm's outside counsel, a woman named Priya Advani who handled our own regulatory matters when they got complicated, called me directly one afternoon. She had never called me directly before. Everything had always gone through Grant. "Diane," she said, "I understand you're going to be out for medical leave soon. I just want to make sure we have clarity on the compliance certification timeline. The one due next month." "It's tracked in the system," I said. "Everything is documented. Karen has full access. So do the 2 paralegals in the compliance queue." There was a pause on the other end. "Right," Priya said. "It's just historically you've handled that certification personally." "Historically, yes. Going forward, it's in the system." Another pause. "Understood," she said, and she hung up. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call, because Priya was smart and Priya was thorough, and Priya had just realized something important. She had realized what the partners had not yet realized, that the firm was about to find out what the checklist actually contained. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday. I took the Wednesday before as my last day in the office. Not officially my last day, of course. On paper, I was going on medical leave with a return date of approximately 8 months out. But I already knew, somewhere in the quiet part of me that had been keeping track, that I was not coming back. I had not said it to Ellis yet. I had not said it to Corinne. I had barely said it to myself, but I knew. That Wednesday I did something I had never done in 17 years. I took a full lunch hour, not a working lunch at my desk with a salad and a spreadsheet, an actual lunch at a small Italian place 3 blocks from the office by myself. I ordered the pasta I actually wanted instead of the salad I thought I should have. I drank a glass of wine at 1 in the afternoon. I read a novel I had been carrying in my bag for 4 months without opening. When I came back, I finished the last few items in my documentation project. The regulatory compliance certification was fully mapped out in the system now. Every step, every dependency, every reviewer contact, every fee schedule, every jurisdictional quirk. If someone with reasonable intelligence and adequate time sat down and read through it in order, they could execute the certification. That was the standard I had held myself to. Whether anyone would actually read it in order was a different question. At 4 in the afternoon, Grant came to my office. He knocked, which was unusual for him. He usually walked in. He sat down across from my desk, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked uncomfortable. "Diane," he said, "I wanted to say something before you go on leave." I waited. "I know the last few weeks have been difficult, and I want you to know that the firm is behind you, whatever you need, whatever the timeline looks like." I nodded politely. "Thank you, Grant. And when you come back," he continued, "we should talk about your role, about recognition, about compensation. I think there's room to have a real conversation about that." There it was, the offer that had been buried under 17 years of "let's revisit this next cycle." The moment the firm realized what it was about to lose, the language changed. Recognition, real conversation, room to talk, all words that meant nothing 3 weeks ago and suddenly meant everything now. I looked at him for a long moment. He was not a bad man. That was the strange part. He was a man who had made a series of small decisions over many years, each one defensible on its own, that had added up to a firm which did not know how to value the people who kept it running. He was realizing that now in the way people realize things when the consequences are close enough to touch but not yet unavoidable. "I appreciate that, Grant," I said, and I meant it in a limited way. He waited for me to say more. I did not. "Well," he said, standing up, "take care of yourself, and please, if there's anything at all we can do, let Rachel know." "I will." He left, and I sat at my desk for a few minutes, feeling nothing in particular, not triumph, not vindication. Just a kind of quiet acknowledgement that the conversation I had waited 17 years for had finally happened, and it had come too late. Not because I was leaving, because the version of me who would have been moved by that conversation no longer existed. I packed up my personal items into a single small box, a framed photograph of Ellis and our daughter, a ceramic mug my mother had given me, a plant that had somehow survived 7 years of fluorescent light. I left everything else exactly as it was, the systems, the documentation, the green dashboard. Then I turned off my computer and went home. The surgery went well. That is a strange sentence to write, because at the time it did not feel like anything went well. It felt like being dropped into a system that used my body as its input and returned me 8 hours later as its output. Ellis was in the recovery room when I woke up. He was holding my hand. He had not left the hospital in 11 hours. The pathology on the removed tissue came back 3 days later, clear margins. No lymph node involvement. Dr. Marston called me personally to deliver the news. She said the word "excellent" twice in one sentence, which I had never heard her say before. Chemotherapy would still proceed as planned because the tumor characteristics warranted it, but the surgical outcome was as good as anyone could have hoped for. I cried when I hung up. Not because of the good news, because I had spent 3 weeks so focused on the firm, so focused on documentation and systems and quiet decisions, that I had not let myself feel what was actually at stake. The firm had been a way to avoid thinking about my body. The moment I no longer had to think about the firm, my body was all I could think about. Ellis let me cry. He did not try to fix anything. He just sat next to me on the couch and put his hand on my back and let me be what I was, which was 51 years old, freshly cut open, and finally allowed to be scared. 2 weeks later, I started chemotherapy, and a week after that, the first call came. It was Corinne. Her voice was careful, not panicked, but careful. Diane, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're not supposed to be working. I'm not working. What's going on? The CLE audit response. The one that was in the queue. It got submitted yesterday. Okay, was there a problem? There was a pause. They submitted it exactly according to the checklist, Karen said, which, as you know, is not actually how you submit it. I closed my eyes for a moment. The CLE audit response was one of the ones that required a supplementary attachment, a cover memo not on the checklist that had to accompany the filing or the state bar would reject it as incomplete. I had documented this in the system, multiple times, in 3 different places, but documentation is only useful if someone reads it. What happened? I asked. The state bar sent back a rejection notice this morning. They gave us 14 days to correct and resubmit, or the CLE credits for 4 partners get invalidated for the audit period. 4 partners, which meant 4 partners whose active bar status depended on those credits. Which meant, if not corrected, 4 partners who could not legally practice law until the credits were reinstated, which, depending on the state and the timing, could take weeks. Karen, I said, who's handling the correction? That's the thing. Nobody knows. Grant asked Rachel. Rachel asked the paralegals. The paralegals said they submitted what was in the system. Grant asked me if I could handle it. What did you tell him? I told him that would be a violation of your medical leave and that I was not authorized to take on your responsibilities during your absence. I smiled, actually smiled, for the first time in a week. Karen, that was exactly the right answer. I know, she said, but Diane, I need to ask. Do you want me to walk them through what to do, off the record? Just point them to the right documentation. I thought about it for a long moment, not because I was tempted to say yes, because I wanted to be certain about why I was saying no. No, I said finally. The documentation is in the system. Everything they need to fix this is there. If they read it, let them read it, Karen. They did not read it, or if they read it, they did not understand what they were reading. The correction window on the CLE audit response closed 14 days later without a compliant resubmission. The state bar invalidated the credits for the 4 partners, and because 2 of those partners were listed as supervising attorneys on active client matters, the firm had to notify those clients that their case leads were temporarily unable to practice. 3 of those clients requested to be reassigned to other firms. I learned all of this from Karen, who called me every few days with updates, not to ask for help, just to keep me informed, the way you keep a friend informed about weather in the city they used to live in. I appreciated it more than I could tell her. The regulatory compliance certification came due 4 weeks into my leave. This was the big one, the annual filing that let Peterson, Hollies, and Vance advertise itself as a full-service practice. Without it, the firm could still operate, but it could not hold itself out publicly as offering certain regulated services. It could not use certain designations in its marketing. It could not, in some jurisdictions, accept new clients in the affected practice areas until the certification was reinstated. The filing required signatures from all 7 partners, submissions from each of the 6 practice licenses, a compiled fee payment of just over $11,000, and a compliance narrative that had to be written from scratch each year to reflect any changes in the firm's operations. I had written that narrative for 17 consecutive years. It lived in my head as much as in the system. The documentation showed the structure. It could not, capture the judgment that went into which changes to emphasize and which to soft pedal for the specific reviewer who read our submissions. The paralegals attempted the narrative. Karen told me later that they had used the previous year's version as a template, updated the dates, and submitted it. That was reasonable. It was also wrong, because 2 of our practice areas had undergone material changes in the past year that the previous narrative did not address, and the reviewer for our jurisdiction had a well-known pattern of rejecting filings that failed to acknowledge known material changes. The filing was rejected. The firm was given 30 days to submit a corrected version. During those 30 days, Peterson, Hollies, and Vance operated in a strange gray zone where its certification was technically pending rather than active. Grant sent an internal memo to all staff instructing them not to reference the certification in any client communications. That memo, Karen told me, was the first time in the firm's history that internal staff had been formally told to obscure a compliance status from clients. The corrected filing was also rejected. This time for a different reason. The compliance narrative had been rewritten, but the supporting documentation for one of the practice areas was missing a schedule that had been required by a rule change 18 months earlier. I had implemented that schedule at the time. I had noted the requirement in the system. But the note was in the section labeled Reviewer Preferences, not Mandatory Attachments, because at the time of the rule change, the state had not yet updated its official checklist to reflect the new requirement. I had known the reviewer expected it. Nobody else did. By the time the second rejection came back, the 30-day window had shrunk to 11 days. And in those 11 days, something happened that I do not think anyone at the firm had ever imagined possible. The State Regulatory Board, having received 2 non-compliant filings in succession from a firm that had submitted 17 consecutive clean filings, issued a formal show-cause order. The order required Peterson, Hollies, and Vance to appear at a hearing to explain why its regulatory compliance certification should not be revoked entirely. Not suspended, revoked. The difference between a pause and an ending. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in early spring. By then I was 4 cycles into chemotherapy, halfway through the hardest part of my treatment. My hair was gone. I had lost 15 pounds. Some days I could barely walk from the bedroom to the kitchen without needing to sit down, but my mind was clear. Clearer in some ways than it had been in years. When your body forces you to slow down that completely, you notice things you had been too busy to see. Karen called me the morning of the hearing. Her voice was quiet. "They're going in with Priya," she said. "Grant, Rachel, and Priya, that's it. No compliance representative. There isn't one, Diane, not really. The paralegals don't know enough to be witnesses. Nobody wants to put them on the stand." I nodded even though she could not see me. "How's Grant?" "He hasn't slept in a week. He came by my desk yesterday. He asked if I thought you would take a call." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I couldn't speak for you." "Good." There was a pause on the line. "He wanted me to tell you something," Karen said. "He said he was sorry, not for anything specific, just sorry. He said you'd know what he meant." I thought about that for a while after we hung up. Whether Grant actually understood what he was apologizing for, whether it mattered. Whether an apology from someone who only apologizes when the consequences are already unavoidable is really an apology at all, or just a form of surrender dressed in softer language. I decided it did not matter, not because I was above it, because I had somewhere else to be with my attention now. The board revoked the certification, not immediately. They gave the firm a 6-month probationary window to demonstrate compliance restructuring, hire a new senior compliance officer with documented credentials, and pass a supplementary audit. During that 6-month window, the firm could not represent itself as a full-service practice in the affected areas. 2 more partners left. 4 more clients requested reassignment. The firm's insurance premiums, tied directly to its regulatory status, increased by a percentage that Karen told me made Grant physically sit down when he heard it. Peterson, Hollies, and Vance did not close. Firms like that rarely close outright. They shrink. They restructure. They eventually re-emerge as smaller versions of themselves with different names on the letterhead. 2 years later, it became Hollies and Vance. Grant retired early. Rachel took a position at a smaller company in a different city. I heard about all of this the way you hear about weather in a place you used to live, distantly, without heat. My treatment ended 14 months after it began. My scans have been clear ever since. I did not go back to compliance work. I did not need to. Ellis and I sold our house, moved to a smaller place near the coast, and I began teaching a course 2 evenings a week at a community college. Introduction to Regulatory Frameworks, basic level, 15 students a semester. I get paid almost nothing for it. I love it more than any job I have ever had. Sometimes a student will ask me why regulation matters, why anyone should care about the small print behind the small print. I tell them the same thing every time. Regulation matters because it is one of the few places in professional life where the people who do the actual work are protected by structure rather than by the goodwill of their employers. And goodwill, I tell them, is a currency that stops circulating the moment you need it most. They usually think I am being dramatic. That is fine. Some of them will find out on their own someday. And when they do, I hope they remember that leaving is also a form of professionalism. And that's sometimes the most important thing a system can teach you, is when to stop holding it together.